That's how you know. So in this story, these foolish Pharisees, going round and round in circles, they ultimately lose their cool and they're cussing and swearing, and so they persecute this man and excommunicate him. It's a very bad sign when religious leaders use persecution. It's a very, very bad sign. And it's doubly bad if they say nasty words, untrue words, angry words about the object that has disconcerted them. But this is the way it's always been. Remember, religion is an organisation like politics and business, and it contains good and bad people. And the most dangerous place in religion is nearest the altar. The more power you have, the more likely you are to be corrupted. All power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. I've seen it work. And I thank God that once in my experience, when they wanted to make me an administrator, I escaped that noose. And I was very glad so to do. Yeah. So these men are going in circles. And the blind man's formerly blind man, he's had enough of it. He loses his patience. Verse 27, I've told you already, and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear again? Do you want to become his disciples too? Well, that was pretty straight, wasn't it? But a man that's lived in the dark has no fears. You and I have a lot of fears because life is so good and so easy. But a man that's lived in the dark, not afraid of anything. They hurled insults at him, spoke about this fellow, Jesus. The man is not cowed. He's not intimidated. This is a beggar talking to the leaders of the church. That often happens. Luther was like a beggar when he spoke against the Pope of his time. It often happens. So this man's not intimidated, and he says, well, this is remarkable. If ever there was irony, here it is. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. Talks more in that vein. Next verse says, the end of it, don't dare you lecture us. I have seen time and time again, and you have too, and we would probably behave the same, that when a man or woman is elevated to a position of leadership, it often proves very corrupting and causes pride that has no real basis. So they say to this man, are you daring to teach us? Yes, he was. So they threw him out. But he loses the synagogue, but he gains heaven. That's not a bad exchange. He loses the synagogue, but he gains heaven. He's put out of the temple, but the Lord of the temple finds him. That's next. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. When he'd found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? Tell me, so that I may believe in him. You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. Christ could talk frankly to this man because the man was honest. Many of us fail to understand because we have wrong motives controlling us. But this man is honest and Jesus is frank. The man said, Lord, see, he's gone from man, prophet, Lord. I believe, and he worshipped him. For judgment I've come into the world, says Jesus, so the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. Now, he didn't come into the world primarily for judgment. He came to save the world, but opposition to his salvation brings judgment. The Pharisees say, "What? Are we blind?" Jesus says, "If you were blind, you'd not be guilty of sin," meaning not as guilty. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. Sins of ignorance are sins, but they're not nearly as bad as willful, known sins. How do I know that's true? Well, on the cross, Jesus said, "Father, forgive them." What's next? For they know not. So there was a sin of ignorance, but they needed forgiveness. So even sins of ignorance are sins. Nature teaches us that. When I think of myself as a young lad, reading a novel for an hour or two while I munch biscuits or sweets, I hope it wasn't only ignorance, it was certainly stupidity. Nature teaches us that we all do many things that come back and wham us. You know, the average person in Australia spends at least 22 or 23 hours a day indoors. It is suicidal. The great agencies of health, apart from diet and thought, are fresh air and sunlight. I'm not talking about sunbaking at midday, but when people spend most of their time away from the light, under fluorescent lights, they are inviting trouble, and trouble will certainly come. Sin of ignorance, but we pay for it. We pay for it. So there are two types of sins: sins of ignorance where we don't know what's right, sins where we do know and don't care. It's the second one that is most detrimental, but even the first one matters. That's why we need to learn all we can about how to live, because we're disciples of Christ and we're the temple of the indwelling Spirit. And we've got to love him not only with our hearts and mind, but with our strength. The next chapter continues this event, and it's the beautiful allegory of the shepherd and the sheep and the door of the sheep, or the gate as modern translations give it. Notice, "I tell you the truth, the man who doesn't enter the sheep pen by the door, the gate, climbs in some other way as a thief and a robber." Now he's talking about those Pharisees. Remember, a text without a context is a pretext. Many illustrations could be given. There's a very famous verse to many people, Daniel 8:14, 2,300 days and the sanctuary be cleansed. It was never studied in its context. And when members of the church drew attention to this, there was a 50-year debate over the meaning of the context. What is the daily of verse 13? Now we're in the midst of a 50-year debate over verse 14. Yeah. Text without a context is a pretext. So this follows on immediately from what is before, and Jesus is saying about the Pharisees, "You are thieves and robbers instead of being shepherds of the flock." I can remember when I was ordained, and you become Pastor Ford or Pastor Brown or Pastor Smith, and you're a little bit proud of that. Hey, I'm a pastor. But the word means shepherd. And there are many people called pastor who are not shepherds. A true pastor will be Christ-centred in his life, because what a man is or what a woman is, far more important than what they say. Preaching's easy, practicing, I nearly use the word D-A-M-N, but that may not be acceptable. Practicing is very hard. Preaching is very easy. So shepherds of the flock, pastors, are ones that are Christ-like. If a minister does not remind you of Christ, there's something missing. 50 years ago, I worked with a very famous evangelist, famous across the sea, very successful, and I learnt much from him. But the thing that worried me was he was not Christ-like. He was not kind. He was not loving. He was not gentle. And that was a real concern to me, because a shepherd of the flock must be like the good shepherd. All others are thieves and robbers despite apparent success. The man who enters in by the gate is the shepherd of his sheep. The watchman opens the gate for him. Sheep listen to his voice, calls his own sheep by name and calls them out. And when he's brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them. The sheep follow him because they know his voice. In the East in those days, the sheep were never driven, they were led. So the true shepherd has to set an example to all the sheep in everything. Boy, that's very demanding. In fact, it's somewhat impossible. But the pastor who doesn't try is not a pastor after God's model. So in the East, the shepherd goes ahead and he knows his sheep by name. Got a wonderful example in the book of Acts where a vision is given to Peter and he's told to go on to a certain street, and the street is named, and he's told to knock on the door of a certain house, and the name of the man in the house is named. Our good shepherd knows us by name. Indeed, he counts the hairs of our head.